Hello, everyone. Today I will touch on why we experience failure in educational reform. We have been discussing this for several weeks now and should be able to see the areas of need within our own districts and perhaps gaining a better understanding of the involvement, the time, the scope of the entire process of school reform. This week's videos really had some great suggestions dealing with why reform often sees failures and what pieces of the puzzle are missing to help bypass failing. The entire reform process is daunting and arduous and often needed, but just like Cuban discusses how reform is cyclical, leads me to question, will the efforts we take now might one day come full circle to be repeated processes again. So what are the benefits to reform? And so I'm going to go on into the goals for this assignment. I'm really hoping that I'm right on track with this assignment. I've included these goals to help me stay on track and on top of things in my and make sure that I'm marking off my list and my checklist. There were, there was a ton of information to read from last week to this week, and to pull information from all of that to be included in a 15-minute recording was quite difficult. So here are the intended goals and objectives for the assignment. To make a checklist of what does and does not work in educational reform, common factors that educational reformers must consider at the school level, challenges of system-wide reform with different campus needs within a district, how individual campus reform can occur, and broader reform agenda for a district, and mediating factors that might complicate the checklist. So what works? Purposeful planning with clear intentions, building capacity through infrastructure, delineated expectations for implementation, support and sustainability, and institutionalization. So with the checklist, I chose to stick with these 5 points that drive what works in terms of school reform. These 5 things tend to be what Mintrop calls change drivers, which move the reform or are the deliberate actions of change. You must have purposeful planning for clear intent and with clear intention, You must build capacity through a somewhat tightly coupled infrastructure, which should be embedded into the organization to make change easier. And there must be delineated expectations for implementation of the reform. Having support only helps to have continued sustainability of the reform, and all of these must be in place for institutionalization of the reform so it does not end in failure. So one example of the district need, not necessarily an individual district need or individual campus need, but we're starting an alternative certification program for new teachers, and so we had to obviously pull in teacher input and other stakeholders from outside to build an organization and plan for something that was tightly coupled in order to get, there's going to be changes along the way. There will definitely be iterations, but to get something that was solidly planned in order to meet the needs of teachers who are alternatively certified, giving them a mentor and getting them through student teaching, in essence, to make them a teacher of record, but to build in those needed supports along the way. It's much like what we're doing with educational reform here in this PowerPoint as I'm talking through this. So purposeful planning with clear intentions. We talk a lot about that reform must be a well thought through process. In terms of action research and school reform research, both Mintrop and Mitra discuss the idea of conducting a needs assessment to determine what areas need change, what will drive the change, and what is the intended impact of the change. There is no silver bullet for reform. However, change, although slightly altered versions of the past, are intended to make something better. Therefore, keeping the end in mind is an important portion of the scope of work. You can't get to the top of the mountain without going through the valley as well. And understanding the multiple tasks, the people involved, and the timeline of the reform are very important to reach the intended results. We oftentimes will do things as a school district that is for everyone without having certain input from places that may not need that change because they've already made really great changes at their school, and that system is working. I think oftentimes we pull in different pieces of reform when we should be looking at the pieces that we've initially initiated and just make those better instead of bringing in all new things, because we have a new superintendent or we have a new assistant superintendent to curriculum or something like that. Sometimes just sticking with what we have because it has been working, not because that's what they're more comfortable with, is something to also consider in the planning piece and making sure that those are clear intentions. Building capacity through infrastructure. Infrastructure must be embedded for change to occur. There are multiple floating pieces that will ultimately need to be in place for people to take the initiative to be part of the change process. Have you made a to-do list to keep you organized through your journey? Do you have people on board with the knowledge and skills necessary to begin implementing the work? What resources are available? Do you have the right people on board with varied abilities? Realizing that Rome was not built in a day, do you have a plan to break down the process and make it more manageable? For the third bulleted item on my list, delineated expectations for implementation. With any leadership type endeavor, there has to be set expectations in place prior to the implementation. So it's just like I can remember laying out classroom expectations and procedures to students who enter my classroom, ensuring that they would know how the classroom would function. In any type of change process, there needs to be input from others and work to create certain norms and expectations, outlining responsibilities, communication, roles, etc. It's the same thing when I did cooperative learning in my classroom. Everybody had a role. If we set up norms, everybody had a chance to participate in norms and setting out what they wanted, their classroom to look like. Another area that is important to determine what tasks are achievable at the time in order to smoothly execute those tasks properly is important. It's hugely important. And by setting benchmarks for the purpose to gauge progress from the needs assessment to know if the team is focusing on meeting initial needs. So support and sustainability. In order to have sustainability, there must be certain support systems in place. Stakeholders are your largest contributors to sustainability within the reform process. It is crucial to know who they are, what drives their motives, to want to be a part, to know if the change will continue if you are no longer around. And it is also good to find some support from outside the organization to give better insight and different guidance perspectives. Figuring out the tools necessary to use to monitor the progress of the reform efforts is a critical piece as well. I definitely like to work with people, and I think if you can build those outside supports and internal supports, you have a better chance of making sure that your reform is successful. For institutionalization, Coughlin and Brannick and Cuban also discussed that from the action research and reform processes as being cyclical. The change process doesn't occur without the end in mind. The intricate planning, collected data, studied, monitoring the progress, implementing the pieces and making changes along the way and targeting goals that point to the end results. The cyclical pattern of this process can be sustainable and institutionalized if the processes are followed and continue to support the needs from the beginning of the desired outcomes in the end. If we fail, we just revamp and continue forward, but we take time to recognize our accomplishments and celebrate our endeavors, because that's also important, and we often forget that piece as well. So I took some time to make this slide of what does not work in school reform. There are several pieces to educational reform that do not work. This is not a comprehensive list of reasons that reform fails, but rather just a bulleted list of the things that do not coincide with the things I included from the 5 items on my initial checklist. Not having a clear purpose or plan is detrimental to reform. If you do not have buy-in from stakeholders, then you are doomed to fail. And I say that like it's doom and gloom. I just think it's a very important piece. And if it's a left out piece, if it's something that you redact from your process, then you ultimately kind of are saying that, we have this under control. There's no necessary need for you to come in and contribute, and you often can hurt yourselves as a school district by not giving community, by not gaining community support, so that when you do roll out like a bond that's necessary to improve the needs of one initial campus, then you hurt your efforts in getting the community to back that support and support that for those schools. Not monitoring the processes will only aid in possible failure. Obviously, what's not monitored is optional. And so it's not oftentimes that people don't want to support the efforts on a school or in a district. It's that sometimes they don't always understand what the intended result is because these things haven't been laid out and you aren't monitoring that. So sometimes it's how we delivered the information. It's the same thing when we go through and took T-tests and reformed that all over the district. Individually, teachers also have a point that it's important to talk to them individually about the reform efforts in their own teaching progress and how in their evaluation they're being evaluated on certain domains, and we need to go in and just talk to them about those and say, hey, I noticed you did this really well. What do you think you might want to improve in? Even though this might be proficient, how do you move from this to accomplished? So it's all about monitoring those processes to ensure that people are taking care of business and that we've done our job into giving them the proper explanation of how to do them. Plan structures must be in place before implementation can occur, and understanding that making changes and having one or more iterations of the initial plan is not failure. Also, the absence of infrastructure capacity and sustainability and the death of reform because it has not been institutionalized. In the third video, Cuban stated that reforms are cyclical in nature and often more like a panacea or one-size-fits-all. If this is true, then to truly have reform that reaches institutionalization, all areas mentioned from earlier readings, i.e., supportive action, sustainability, stakeholder backing must be deeply rooted in the culture of the system to ensure the cycle of this reform is producing desired changes meant to serve the organization for years to come. So I know that this is kind of an odd way to look at it, but sometimes my creative juices have to go somewhere so that I can make a connection here. I sometimes think of reform as being akin to a Rorschach test or an inkblot test. The Rorschach test was basically a personality test, but here's how I explain it. So both sides have similarities, but slightly differ. There are multiple layers of shading, which tricks the eye to seeing something that may or may not actually be important to the overall desired results needed to make a determination. So perhaps we can overlook something very important because we only see the big picture or small details. Reform is truly about the general approach to perception. So you have two sides that see two different perspectives or have two different perspectives. Not that one is better than the other one. It's where we must come together and collaborate, not always completely agreeing over things, but to understand that change is needed based on on these perspectives and other perspectives, and determined to implement change that serves to benefit most people in the organization. We know, again, there's no silver bullet in educational reform. Therefore, there's no perfect plan. But if we have those necessary steps in place from the original checklist listed at the beginning, then we know that this is what works to sustain and hopefully institutionalize institutionalize the reform effort, so that if I am the leader and I walk away, this continues to be something that's embedded in the culture, and it's the way we do things. It can slightly be tweaked to meet the needs of those people who are still there and the students that are still there, or if the demographics change or what have you, but that it's part of the culture. I just go back to it's part of the culture. So if we have purposeful planning with clear intentions and we build capacity through infrastructure, we've got delineated expectations for the implementation process. We have supports built in and to ensure sustainability. And once all of those are built in and completed and they're solid, then we have institutionalization. And my last slide are my references. which I just kind of wrote down who I talked about, and I really appreciate your time. Don't forget, school reform and Rorschach tests, it's often not as clearly seen, almost like a general approach to perception. So remember, perception is everything. Thanks, guys. Have